The most profound ache of my existence was not the gnawing hunger in my belly, but the chilling certainty that if I were to vanish into thin air, the world would take a full day to notice my absence. I was a ghost haunting the edges of my own life, a collection of duties and sacrifices stitched together in the shape of a woman named Lyra. The weight of my younger sibling's survival pressed down on my shoulders, a constant physical burden that stole the very air from my lungs and replaced it with the dust of our blighted land. This feeling of being utterly trapped, a silent scream in a world that refuses to listen. I wonder if it echoes in the quiet corners of your own heart. Tell me your name, where you are watching this from, and what time it is in your part of the world. If this journey of a forgotten soul already speaks to you, please subscribe to the channel and walk this path with me. Our village was a testament to slow decay, a wound on the earth that had long since stopped, bleeding and begun to fester. The fields were cracked mosaics of barren soil, and the wind, once a carrier of sweetgrass and summer rain, now only whispered of famine and despair. My days were a monotonous cycle of mending clothes already more patch than fabric, of boiling roots for a thin, tasteless broth, and of watching the shadows grow longer, heralding another night of cold and fear. My hands were calloused and raw, my back ached with a weariness that had settled deep into my bones, but the most profound exhaustion was in my soul. I was a protector, a provider, a mother to the two small children who were my only reason for drawing breath, but I had long forgotten the person I was supposed to be beneath it all. The heaviest responsibility was the lie I lived every evening. I would divide our meager rations between Ilara and Finn, their small faces smudged with dirt, but their eyes still holding a flicker of childhood's light that I fought desperately to protect. When Finn would ask why my bowl was always empty, I'd smile and claim I'd eaten while they were out playing, a falsehood that tasted more bitter than any hunger. Ilara, older and quieter, would simply watch me with a knowing sadness that shattered my heart. He understood the sacrifice. This crushing guilt was my constant companion, the feeling that I was failing the promise I had made to our dying parents. I was keeping them alive, but I was not giving them a life, and the distinction was a blade twisting in my gut with every sunrise. Our precarious existence was held together by a single, fraying thread, the debt owed to the village elder, a man whose heart was as barren as our fields. His weekly visits were not mere collections, they were calculated acts of torment. He would let his gaze linger on me, his words dripping with vile suggestion, reminding me that there were other currencies besides coin with which a young woman could pay her dues. The humiliation was a physical force, leaving me trembling with a rage that had no outlet. I would stand my ground, my voice a cold shard of ice, but each encounter chipped away at my resolve. The other villagers would turn away, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and relief that it was not them. In this place of shared suffering, I had never felt more utterly and terrifyingly alone. One evening, after the elder had gone, leaving the stench of his cruelty lingering in our tiny cottage, I finally broke. I sank to the floor, the last of my strength giving way to a wave of absolute despair. The options before me were a gallery of horrors, each path leading to a different kind of destruction. It was in that moment, when the darkness seemed absolute, that a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from our door. It was not the shuffling step of a neighbor or the heavy boot of the elder. Standing on my doorstep was a figure cloaked in midnight blue, his face impassive, holding a scroll sealed with the shimmering, unfamiliar crest of a moonstone tree. It was a summons from the elven High King, an offer, a pact, a trade of one impossible cage for another, promising a fate I could not even begin to comprehend. The scroll in my hand felt heavier than a gravestone, its smooth, foreign parchment a stark contrast to my calloused fingers. The moonstone seal seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, a cold fire that promised a different kind of burning than the slow starvation I knew. This was not a choice. It was an exchange of cages, a desperate gamble where the only currency I had left was myself, the Elven High King. The name was a myth, a whisper from a world of silver forests and eternal twilight, a world that had no place for a woman made of dust and desperation. Yet his summons offered a reprieve from the slow death of our village. It offered food for Elara and Finn, a future I could no longer carve out of our barren earth. The fear was a living thing in my throat, but the alternative, watching my siblings fade. Before my eyes was a horror far more profound. This pact was my only terrifying path forward. My past was a tapestry woven with loss, the threads pulled taut by the final rattling breaths of my parents. They had succumbed to the same blight that now choked our fields, leaving me with a deathbed promise to protect the little ones. I was 16. The weight of that vow crushed the last vestiges of my own youth, transforming me from a girl who once dreamed of spring flowers into a sentinel, guarding against the encroaching dark. I remembered my mother's hands, surprisingly soft, teaching me to knead bread, and my father's laughter, a deep rumble that could make the very rafters of our cottage shake. Now, those memories were ghosts, their edges blurred by the constant grinding reality of survival. The primary wound of my life was not their death, but the crushing responsibility it left behind, a debt to their memory that I could never fully repay, forcing me to sacrifice my own soul. Piece by piece, this sense of being a ghost was cemented by the village itself. In their eyes, I was not Lyra. I was a tragic story, a walking reminder of the famine's toll. The women would offer me thin-lipped pity, their gazes sliding past me to my siblings, while the men saw only a burden, or as the elder did, an opportunity. I was an object of contempt, a symbol of their collective failure to thrive. Their rejection was a constant, low-grade fever in my blood, isolating me more completely than any physical wall. I learned to build my own fortress of silence, to make myself smaller, less visible, so as not to invite their scorn or their pity. This profound social abandonment taught me a brutal lesson. To be noticed was to be judged, and to be judged was to be found wanting. My invisibility became my shield, but it was also the slow-acting poison that eroded any sense of self-worth I might have once possessed. The concept of romance, of love given freely, was a language I could not comprehend. It was a luxury for girls with full bellies and futures that stretched beyond the next sunrise. For me, a touch was either a threat or a transaction. The elder's leering gaze had taught me that my body was a commodity, its value measured in bushels of grain or silver coins. The thought of a man's hands on me for any reason other than a cold exchange filled me with a primal revulsion. How could I ever dream of a gentle caress when every ounce of my physical being was dedicated to the harsh labor of survival? The summons for a packed bride held no romance. It was merely a contract on a grander scale. I was not a woman to be cherished. I was a sacrifice to be offered, and I had long since accepted the grim utility of that role. Leaving Elara and Finn was the single most painful act of my life, an amputation of my own heart. I left them in the care of the one neighbor who had shown us slivers of kindness, with a pouch containing the first payment from the Elven Pact, more coin than our family had seen in a generation. Finn, too young to understand, clung to my leg, his small face streaked with tears as he begged me not to go. But it was Elara's silence that shattered me. She simply stood there, her eyes, so much like our mother's, filled with a terrible adult understanding. She knew this was not a journey I would return from. I knelt before her, pressing my forehead to hers, and whispered a promise to keep them safe, a promise that now felt like a desperate prayer, cast into an uncaring wind, Walking away from them without looking back took a strength I did not know I possessed. The journey to Ethelgard was a disorienting plunge into a world I never knew existed. I was escorted by 2 elven guards, silent figures in gleaming silver armor who moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and unsettling. We left the cracked plains and dust-choked air of my home behind, traveling through ancient forests where the very air hummed with a strange, vibrant energy. The trees were taller than any mountain I had ever seen, their leaves shimmering with shades of emerald and sapphire. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in ethereal shafts, illuminating moss that glowed with a soft internal luminescence. The sheer, overwhelming vitality of this land was an assault on my senses, a stark and cruel contrast to the dying world I had just left. I felt like a creature of shadow trespassing in a realm of impossible light, my drab, patched clothing a mark of my otherness, my unworthiness. Finally, after days of silent travel, we arrived. Ethelgard did not rise from the ground so much as it grew from it, a city of graceful, crystalline spires that pierced the clouds, all connected by bridges of woven light. The gates, wrought from a material that looked like polished moonlight, swung open without a sound, revealing a kingdom that defied every law of nature I had ever known. Waterfalls cascaded from floating islands, and the air smelled of night-blooming jasmine and something ancient, like petrichor after a magical storm. I was led through courtyards of impossible beauty, past elves whose serene, perfect faces watched me with unnerving curiosity. They brought me into the heart of the palace, a throne room so vast it seemed to hold the sky itself, and left me standing alone on the cold moonstone floor, a trembling human offering before an empty, formidable throne, utterly lost and terrified of the fate that awaited me. The throne was not a seat of comfort, but an anchor of immense, crushing weight, carved from a single piece of living moonstone that pulsed with a cold, faint light. Upon it sat High King Cailan, a figure forged from silver and shadow. His hair was the color of spun moonlight, falling in stark contrast to the deep, midnight blue of his regal attire. His face was a masterpiece of elven perfection, all sharp angles and serene lines, yet his eyes, the color of a winter storm, held a weariness that belied his ageless appearance. He did not merely occupy the throne, he commanded the very silence of the vast hall, his presence a palpable force that seemed to bend the light and air around him. Every subtle shift of his weight, every slow breath he took, was a testament to the burden of a crown he wore not just on his head, but deep within his soul, a suffocating legacy of power and expectation. His reign was a constant, silent war, fought not with swords, but with words in the hallowed chambers of his council. He was a king of vision in a kingdom shackled by tradition. The lords who advised him were ancient, their minds as unyielding as the petrified forests that bordered their lands. They saw his desire for change, for opening Ethelgard to new forms of magic, for seeking alliances beyond their shimmering borders, as the folly of a young king who did not understand the sanctity of their isolation. They spoke of purity, of heritage, of the old ways that had kept them safe for millennia. But Cailan heard only the brittle whisper of decay. Their resistance was a suffocating shroud, their polite, condescending arguments chipping away at his authority with every passing season, leaving him a ruler in name but a prisoner to his own court. This political stalemate was a symptom of a far deeper sickness, a blight that was invisible to most, but screamed at Cailan with every fibre of his being. The magic of his people was fading. It was a slow, insidious decline, like a tide receding from a shore for the very last time. The crystalline spires of the city no longer sang with the same vibrant energy. The enchanted streams ran a little quieter, and the very air, once thick with power, now felt thin and fragile. He could feel it in his own bones. a creeping coldness where a fire once burned. The council blamed this decay on his modern ideas, claiming his lack of respect for tradition was weakening the core of their world. They were blind to the truth. Their tradition was the very poison that was slowly killing them, and the weight of finding an antidote rested solely upon him. Kaelin's most guarded secret was also his only source of hope, a double-edged sword of prophetic magic that had haunted and guided him for years. He had seen her. In his visions, she was not an abstract solution, but a living, breathing woman of impossible strength, her spirit a defiant flame against a backdrop of dust and despair. He had witnessed her sacrifices, felt the echo of her silent screams, and fallen in love with the fierce, protective soul he saw, trapped within a cage of hardship. He knew her name was Lyra. This was not a political maneuver. It was an act of desperate, unyielding faith in a woman he already cherished, with a depth that would be seen as madness. If his court ever discovered his decision was born from visions and a secret love for a human commoner, they would not just depose him, they would see him utterly ruined. He needed her not as a bride, but as a heart. His visions had been clear. Her human resilience, forged in the crucible of suffering and loss, held the key to their salvation. The elves, in their long, serene existence, had forgotten how to fight, how to burn, how to truly live. Lyra was pure fire, a spark of raw, untamed life that he believed could rekindle the dying embers of his people's magic. The pact was a desperate gamble, an importation of the one thing his perfect, sterile world lacked. A soul that had been broken and had painstakingly pieced itself back together. To his court, she was a contamination, a human blight on their sacred lineage. To Kaelin, she was a prophecy of renewal, the only future he could see for Ethelgard, and he had risked his crown, his life, and his entire kingdom on the hope that his visions were true. The weight of his decision settled upon him as the news of her arrival echoed through the silent throne room. She was here. The woman from his dreams, the flame in the darkness, was now within the cold, crystalline walls of his palace. For a moment, a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear shot through him, a fear that the reality of her would shatter the hope he had nurtured in secret for so long. He dismissed the lingering council lords with a sharp, impatient wave of his hand. The political games could wait. He had to see her, to stand in the same room and breathe the same air as the woman who held his kingdom's fate in her small, calloused hands. He turned to his royal guard, his voice low but resonant with an authority that left no room for question. "Bring her to me," he commanded. "Now!" The order was absolute, a stone dropped into a still pool, its ripples destined to change everything. When I was finally led into the throne room, the silence was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. The chamber was a cavern of shimmering crystal and polished moonstone, vast enough to hold 100 of my village huts, yet it felt utterly empty save for the solitary figure on the throne. He was not a man, but a living sculpture of power and sorrow. High King Kaelin's presence was an immediate, overwhelming force, a magnetic pull that rooted me to the spot. His silver hair seemed to capture the faint, ethereal light of the hall, and his eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, fixed on me with an intensity that stripped away every defense I had ever built. In that first, terrifying moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life, not just a peasant, but a speck of dust in a world of impossible ancient grandeur. He raised a single elegant hand, and the 2 guards who had escorted me bowed low and retreated, their silver armor whispering as they moved. The great crystalline doors closed behind them with a soft final chime, sealing us inside the echoing silence. Then, in a movement so fluid it seemed to defy the weight of his crown and robes, he descended the few steps from his throne. He did not rush, but his approach was relentless, each step closing the cavernous distance between us until he stood only a few feet away. The air grew thick, charged with an energy I could feel on my skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the thunderous command of a king I had expected, but a low, resonant timbre that held the weariness of centuries. "Lyra," he said, and the sound of my own name, spoken with such reverence, was the most disarming thing I had ever heard. He did not ask about my journey or my village. Instead, he began to speak of his own, of Ethelgard. He spoke of a sickness, not of the body, but of the soul of his people. He described their magic as a great, ancient fire that was slowly, inexorably turning to ash, leaving a creeping cold in its wake. His council, he explained, was a collection of relics, elves so bound by tradition that they would rather watch their world fade into twilight than embrace the dawn of a new age. As he spoke, the powerful king before me seemed to transform. The facade of absolute authority cracked, revealing a man burdened by a desperate, lonely fight. He was a leader watching his kingdom die from the inside out, his every effort to save it thwarted by the very people he was trying to protect. His vulnerability was a shocking, unexpected blow. Then his gaze, which had been distant as he described his kingdom's plight, returned to me with that same unnerving intensity. He told me of a predestination, of ancient prophecies that spoke of a spark from the outside world, a heart of mortal fire that held the key to their renewal. He spoke of it not as a certainty, but as a desperate final hope. "Our longevity has become our weakness, Lyra," he confessed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We have forgotten what it means to struggle, to burn, to feel the sharp edges of life. We are fading because we have forgotten how to live." He looked at me then, and for the first time I felt as though he was not just seeing a human girl, but looking directly into the scarred, calloused core of my soul, seeing all the hardship and fight I had endured not as a flaw, but as a source of immense, untapped power. "I did not summon you here to be a mere bride," Kaelin stated, the words hanging in the crystalline air with absolute clarity. "I am proposing an alliance, a pact." He explained his plan with a cold, political precision that was a stark contrast to the emotion he had just shown. He needed a queen, a symbol to shatter the council's stagnation and signal a new era for his people. The union would be a formality, a performance for his court. He would present me as the fulfillment of the prophecy, a bridge to the mortal world that would revitalize their own. In return for my role in this grand, desperate theater, he would grant me anything I desired. It was a business transaction, an exchange of my presence for his power, a cage of gold for my cage of dust. The offer was so immense, so far beyond the scope of my reality, that I could barely process it. The full weight of his offer settled on me, a crushing, beautiful avalanche. He spoke of a protected estate for Ilara and Finn, a place of warmth and learning, guarded by his own royal sentinels, where they would want for nothing for the rest of their lives. He spoke of clearing every debt, of sending enough resources to my village to ensure no one would starve for a generation. He was offering me the one thing I had never dared to dream of, an end to the struggle. He was offering me the power to not just save my siblings, but to truly give them a life, the life our parents would have wanted for them. The promise was a seductive poison, a beautiful lie that I wanted desperately to believe. All I had to do was trade my life, to become a queen in a silent, gilded play, and the suffering that had defined my entire existence would simply cease. I stood there, a silent statue in the heart of his kingdom, the echoes of his proposal warring with a lifetime of ingrained powerlessness. For my entire life, others had dictated my value, my purpose, my fate. The village elder, the villagers, the hunger itself, they had all been my masters. Now this impossibly powerful king was offering me a choice, albeit a choice between two prisons. But in his desperation, he had given me something he hadn't intended to. A sliver of leverage. A strange, cold fire began to burn in my chest, a defiance I thought had been extinguished long ago. I was not just a symbol. I was not just a prophecy. I was Lyra. I had survived, I had fought, and I would not be a passive pawn in his royal game. I lifted my chin, meeting his stormy gaze without flinching. My voice, when it finally came, was rusty from disuse, a fragile thing in the vast hall, yet it did not tremble. "I accept your terms," I said, and I saw a flicker of relief cross his perfect features, a subtle easing of the tension in his shoulders. He had gotten what he wanted. But I was not finished. The girl who had starved and scraped and fought for every scrap of dignity was not going to simply surrender. "But I have one condition of my own," I added, my voice gaining strength with each word. He stilled, his surprise evident. He had expected gratitude, perhaps fear, but not a negotiation. I held his gaze, pouring every ounce of will I possessed into my next words. "You will show them to me," I demanded. "You will take me to see my brother and sister, and you will give me your unbreakable vow, king to peasant, that they are safe and cared for as you promise. Only then will I be your queen." Kaelin's concession was a silent, almost imperceptible nod, an acceptance of my terms that felt more significant than any royal decree. He had agreed to my demand, a small victory that sent a tremor of unfamiliar power through my veins. The ceremony, he explained, would not be a grand affair for the masses, but a binding rite, performed in the Heartwood Grove, a place of ancient power where oaths were etched into the very magic of Ethelgard. I was escorted from the throne room, not to a cell, but to a suite of rooms that overlooked a garden of glowing flora. There, I was given a simple gown of deep forest green, a fabric softer than anything I had ever touched. It was a costume for the role I was about to play, a silken shackle to replace my rags, and as I dressed, I felt a profound and chilling sense of finality. The transaction was nearly complete. My life was no longer my own. The Heartwood Grove was not a constructed temple, but a living sanctuary. Ancient trees, their bark shimmering with veins of raw moonstone, formed a natural cathedral, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the twilight into a soft, ethereal glow. A single, flat stone altar stood in the center, pulsating with a gentle, rhythmic light. Kaelin was already there, standing beside it, his silver hair a stark beacon in the verdant gloom. He was not dressed in his heavy royal regalia, but in simpler, dark blue robes that seemed to absorb the shadows. The High Council was present, a silent semicircle of ancient elven lords, their faces impassive masks of judgment. Their collective gaze felt like a physical weight, 1,000 years of tradition and prejudice pressing down on me, the human impurity about to be bound to their king. Lord Valerius, a tall elf with eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky, stood at the forefront of the council. His disapproval was a palpable force, radiating from him. In waves of icy contempt, he watched my approach not as the arrival of a queen, but as the progression of a disease, a blight walking into their most sacred space. The other lords mirrored his sentiment, their serene faces betraying nothing but their rigid posture, and the tight set of their lips spoke volumes. They saw this pact as a desperate, foolish gambit, a stain on their lineage. I was not a person to them, I was a symbol of their king's fallibility, a mortal weakness he had inexplicably chosen to bind himself to. Their silent, unified condemnation was more intimidating than any spoken threat, a wall of hostility that I had to walk through to reach the altar. Kaelin's voice, when he began the rite, was a low, steady anchor in the sea of silent judgment. He spoke the ancient words of the binding pact, his tone formal for the benefit of his council, but his eyes never left mine. He spoke of two worlds uniting, of a future intertwined, of strength found in alliance. But woven into the traditional text were phrases that felt intensely personal, words that seemed to come from the visions he had described. He spoke of a flame foreseen in the coming dark, and a heart of resilience to mend what is broken. To the council, it was mere poetic flourish. To me, it was a terrifying and intimate declaration. He was not just binding himself to a political ally, he was tethering his soul to the woman he believed he had known for years, placing the weight of his prophecy directly upon my shoulders. When it was my turn, I did not have ancient poetry to offer. My voice was clear and steady, stripped of any emotion save for a cold, hard resolve. I met Kaelin's intense gaze, but my words were for myself, a final reminder of the price and the prize. "I accept this pact," I stated, the simple words echoing in the sacred silence. "I will stand as your queen and uphold the terms of our agreement in exchange for the safety and future of my family." There was no promise of love, no vow of devotion. It was the stark, unvarnished truth of our bargain, a verbal contract laid bare before the ancient trees and the disapproving lords. A flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, or understanding, crossed Kaelin's face before he masked it once more, his regal composure firmly back in place. The rite required a physical bond. An elven priestess, her face veiled in shadow, came forward with a single, shimmering cord that seemed woven from pure starlight. She took my right hand, and Kaelin's left, placing them one atop the other on the glowing altar stone. My skin was rough and calloused against his, which was cool and impossibly smooth. As the priestess began to wrap the cord of light around our joined hands, a jolt of energy shot through me. It was not the cold, impersonal hum of the altar, but a sudden, shocking warmth that originated from his touch. It was a current of pure, unadulterated life, a heat that seemed to seek out the coldest, most broken parts of my soul. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat, utterly unprepared for the sensation of his life force meeting mine. As the final knot of light was tied, the glow on the altar stone flared, bathing the grove in a brilliant, momentary dawn. "The pact is sealed," the priestess declared, her voice like the rustling of ancient leaves. "The queen is bound to the king is bound to the queen, so it is written in the heartwood." A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the ground, the very magic of the land acknowledging the new reality. Lord Valerius's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only crack in his marble facade. The pact was done. It was irreversible. I was no longer Lyra, the forgotten girl from a dying village. I was the High Queen of Ethelgard, a title that felt as foreign and ill-fitting as the fine gown I wore, a brand seared upon my very being by a cord of starlight. Tradition, Kaelin had explained, demanded one final act to seal the rite in the eyes of the court. A kiss. The word had hung in the air between us, a cold, clinical necessity. Now the moment was upon us. He turned to me, the light from the altar casting strange, dancing shadows across his perfect face. The council watched, their eyes like chips of ice, waiting for this final symbolic gesture of submission from their new human queen. I braced myself, expecting a brief, passionless press of lips, a kingly duty performed with detached grace. It was just another part of the price. Another piece of myself I had to give away. I lifted my chin, my body rigid, ready for the cold finality of the act. Another touch that was meant to be a transaction. He moved slowly, closing the small space between us. His hand, no longer bound to mine, rose to cup my jaw, his thumb gently tracing the line of my cheek. The touch was so unexpectedly tender it stole the air from my lungs. Then he leaned in, and his lips met mine. It was not the cold, formal kiss of a king. It was a breath of warmth in a lifetime of winter, a gentle, searching pressure that held no demand, only a profound, heartbreaking sorrow and a desperate, unspoken longing. For a split second, the High King of Ethelgard vanished, and all that was left was a man, pouring years of secret, impossible devotion into a single devastating touch. It was not a seal on a pact. It was a confession, a silent plea that shattered my defenses and left me trembling. He pulled away far too quickly, his composure snapping back, into place like a shield, but the storm in his eyes was now a maelstrom of raw, unguarded emotion. The council had seen a king perform his duty. Lord Valerius saw only the confirmation of a fatal weakness. But I had felt the truth, the agreement, the terms, the cold, hard lines of our bargain had just been consumed by a fire I never knew existed. This was not a cage of gold and politics. It was something infinitely more complex and dangerous. The man before me was not my master or my keeper. He was my king, and he was in love with a ghost he had only just met. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me terrified not of the pact, but of the man I was now bound to. The days that followed our binding were a disorienting blend of suffocating opulence and chilling isolation. I was given chambers so vast that my entire childhood cottage could fit within the antechamber alone, with silks that felt like water against my skin, and food so rich it made my stomach ache. Yet I found myself drawn not to the grandeur, but to the palace's quiet, forgotten corners. I discovered a library where scrolls were stacked to the ceiling, their ancient parchments smelling of dust and time. It was there, hidden amongst the histories of kings and star charts, that Cailan would often find me. He would not announce himself, but I would feel his presence, a subtle shift in the air, a warmth that cut through the library's cool silence. He'd simply stand with me, our shoulders almost touching, as we looked over a map of a world I never knew existed, a silent companionship that spoke more than 1,000 empty pleasantries. These stolen moments became my only solace, a fragile bridge between our two disparate worlds. One afternoon, while I was tracing the faded ink of a poem about a mortal woman who loved a star, he spoke, his voice a low murmur. He told me the story behind the words, of the poet's longing and the star's impossible descent. There was a profound melancholy in his tone, a reflection of his own impossible love for the woman in his visions. I felt a strange, protective ache in my chest, a desire to ease the burden I saw in his storm-grey eyes. I found myself asking about his own studies, about the fading magic he was so desperate to understand. In these conversations, the king and his pact bride would vanish, leaving only two lonely souls sharing the weight of their respective worlds. The pretense of our arrangement momentarily forgotten in the shared intimacy of the quiet. The court, however, was not a quiet library. It was a viper's nest of serene faces and venomous whispers. My presence at the High Council meetings was a requirement of my station, and it was a form of exquisite torture. I would sit on a smaller yet still ornate throne beside Cailan, a silent human doll on display. Lord Valerius and his faction never addressed me directly. Instead, they would speak of the impurities that could weaken their bloodlines, of the fickle nature of short-lived races, and of the desperate measures that could lead a kingdom to ruin. Each word was a precisely aimed dart, intended to remind me and everyone else in the chamber that I was an outsider, a contamination, a temporary solution to a permanent problem. I would keep my back straight and my gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. The humiliation was a familiar cloak, but the rage it now ignited was new. It was a fire fanned by Kaelin's subtle reactions. I would see the muscle in his jaw tighten, the cold fury that would flash in his eyes before being suppressed behind a mask of regal indifference. He could not openly challenge his counsel on such matters without appearing weak, ruled by his affection for a human. So he fought back in his own way. He would direct questions to me in the middle of their veiled insults, asking my opinion on trade routes or resource allocation for the human territories. He would listen to my simple, practical answers with rapt attention, giving my words a weight they did not possess, a deliberate and public validation that infuriated the traditionalist lords. It was a silent, dangerous battle fought in the spaces between words, and I was the contested ground. The simmering hostility finally boiled over during the Midwinter Starfall Gala, a grand affair where the entire elven nobility gathered. I wore a gown of midnight blue, spun with silver thread, a garment meant to make me look like a queen, but I felt like a lamb decorated for slaughter. Throughout the evening I was subjected to the cold shoulders and condescending smiles of elves, whose beauty was as sharp and unforgiving as glass. They would speak around me, their lyrical language a wall I could not penetrate. It was Lady Alara, a cousin of Lord Valerius, who finally voiced the court's collective disdain. As Kaelin was momentarily drawn away by a dignitary, she approached me, her smile thin and cruel. "It must be so difficult," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby, "trying to comprehend traditions that are older than your entire species." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The surrounding nobles paused, their eyes glinting with malicious anticipation. My throat closed, the familiar feeling of being small and worthless washing over me. But before I could even flinch, Kaelin was there. He had moved so silently, so swiftly, that he seemed to have materialized from the shadows. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply placed his hand on the small of my back, a gesture of both possession and protection, and fixed Lady Alara with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the wine in her goblet. "Her species," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper that cut through the sudden silence, "has mastered something yours has forgotten, Lady Alara. Resilience. They do not break. They endure." The power in his voice was absolute, a king defending not just his queen, but his choice, his belief, his heart. He then turned his attention from the stunned noblewoman to the entire assembly, his voice rising to command the vast hall. "My queen is not here to comprehend our traditions. She is here to help us forge new ones," he declared, his arm wrapping more securely around my waist, pulling me against his side. "Her heart holds the fire of survival, a strength Ethelgard has not known for centuries. You will show her the respect she is owed, not because I command it, but because she has earned it through a life of hardship none of you could possibly imagine." He then looked down at me, and for a breathtaking moment, the entire court, the politics and the pressure faded away. There was only the fierce, unwavering devotion in his eyes, a public declaration that went far beyond the terms of our pact. He was not protecting a political asset. He was shielding the woman he loved. In the stunned silence that followed his decree, I felt the world shift on its axis. The whispers died, replaced by wide, uncertain eyes. Lord Valerius's face was a mask of thunderous fury, his public humiliation complete. Kaelin had not just defended me, he had thrown down a gauntlet, drawing a line in the moonstone floor of his court. He had openly championed my human flaws as virtues, turning their greatest criticism into my greatest strength. The warmth of his hand on my back was a searing, Brand. A claim that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He led me from the center of the room, the nobles parting before us like a receding tide. For the first time since I had arrived in this kingdom of impossible beauty and cold hearts, I did not feel like a sacrifice. I felt like a queen. Later that night, in the quiet of my chambers, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a tremor of profound confusion. Kaelin came to me, dismissing my attendance with a flick of his wrist. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was charged, humming with the unspoken truths of the evening. He stood by the window, gazing out at the glowing gardens, his back to me. "I apologize if my actions tonight put you in a more difficult position," he said, his voice strained. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "You defended me," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He finally turned, his face etched with a conflict that seemed to tear him apart. The king was gone, and in his place was the man I had glimpsed in the library, the man who had confessed his kingdom's decay, the man whose kiss had felt like a desperate prayer. He took a step toward me, then another, until he was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "It was not a political move, Lyra," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I could not stand there and listen to them speak of you that way. I could not bear it." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair from my cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited a fire deep within me. All the lines of our agreement, the cold, hard contract that defined our union, had dissolved in the heat of his public defense and the devastating tenderness of this moment. I looked into his eyes and saw the truth he had tried so hard to conceal. The visions, the prophecy, the desperate hope. It was all real, and I was falling for him. This realization was a terrifying plunge into an unknown abyss. My feelings for him were a betrayal of the one thing that had kept me safe my entire life, my emotional detachment. Love was a vulnerability I could not afford, a luxury for souls who were not bartered and sold. We were bound by a pact, a performance for his court, a means to an end. But as I stood there, trapped in the intensity of his gaze, a dangerous question echoed in the deepest part of my heart, a whisper that threatened to shatter everything. Are we even pretending anymore? The thought was a seismic shock, breaking apart the careful foundations of my survival. To admit this was to admit that the gilded cage had become a home, and its keeper, the king of my heart. I was no longer just his queen. I was becoming his. Just as the fragile confession hung unspoken in the air between us, a sharp, urgent knock came at the door. The moment was shattered. Kaelin stiffened, the kingly mask slamming back into place. He turned and opened the door to reveal his chief guard, his face grim. The guard bowed low, holding out a scroll sealed with the dark wax of the High Council. "Your Majesty," the guard said, his voice grave, "Lord Valerius has invoked the succession mandate. The Council formally demands that you and the Queen begin the rites of procreation to secure a true elven heir for the throne of Ethelgard." The words struck me like a physical blow. The political had just become painfully, terrifyingly personal, forcing our fragile, unspoken bond toward a new, unavoidable crisis that neither of us was prepared to face. The Council's decree fell into the silence of my chambers like a block of ice, shattering the fragile warmth that had just begun to bloom between us. Kaelin's face, which moments before had been an open book of raw emotion, became a mask of cold, regal fury. He stepped back, the distance he created feeling like a mile-wide chasm. The king had returned, and the man who had defended me, who had almost confessed his heart, was gone. A chilling dread washed over me, a fear not of the physical act the council demanded, but of its meaning. It was the final colonization of my being, the transformation of my body into a political instrument, a vessel for their heir. The beautiful room, my gilded cage, suddenly felt suffocating, its walls closing in, reminding me that I was not a queen, but a broodmare whose value was measured only by her womb. The unspoken feelings between us curdled into a new, unbearable tension, a silent accusation that this, too, was part of the price. In the days that followed, a profound and painful distance grew between us. Cailan became a ghost in his own palace, a whirlwind of kingly duties that seemed deliberately designed to keep him from me. The shared moments in the library, the quiet companionship that had become my lifeline, ceased completely. He was once again the solitary king, consumed by meetings with grim-faced generals and endless debates with his council, the weight of his crown pressing him back into a shape I no longer recognized. I would see him across a courtyard or at the far end of a hall, and the look in his eyes was one of deep, agonizing conflict. This withdrawal was a wound far deeper than any of the court's veiled insults. It felt like a final, devastating abandonment, as if the man who saw the fire in my soul was now terrified of being burned by the very mandate meant to bind us closer. I could not endure the silence. It was a poison seeping into the cracks of my resolve, making me doubt everything I had started to feel. I finally found him in the high observatory, a circular room where the ceiling was a dome of enchanted glass, showing the constellations in stark, brilliant clarity. He stood before it, a solitary figure dwarfed by the cosmos. My voice, when I spoke his name, was a fragile thing in the vast, quiet space. I asked him to tell me the truth, all of it. I told him I could not be a piece in a game whose rules were hidden from me. Was this always part of the pact, Cailan? I asked, the words tasting like ash. Was an heir the price you were never willing to name? The accusation, born of a desperate need to understand, hung between us, as sharp and cold as the starlight that filled the room. My question shattered his composure. He turned from the star chart, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it stole my breath. He finally confessed the terrible, hidden clause of the prophecy he had been carrying alone. The visions had not just foretold my arrival as a catalyst for their magic's renewal. They were specific. The true revitalization of Ethelgard would come only through a child born of our union, an heir who would embody both the resilience of humanity and the ancient magic of the elves, a living bridge destined to heal their fading world. The Council's demand wasn't merely a political maneuver, it was their brutal, literal interpretation of the sacred texts. Then he delivered the final blow. The prophecy was tied to a celestial event, the convergence of whispering stars, which was now only weeks away. If we failed to conceive an heir by then, their magic would be lost forever, and his reign would be branded a catastrophic failure. The full weight of his secret was a crushing blow, reframing every moment we had shared. He hadn't just been hiding his feelings, he had been shielding me from a terrible, prophetic destiny. I never wanted this to be your burden, he whispered, his voice cracking under the strain of his long-held secret. I brought you here to be a queen, not a sacrifice. The prophecy can be damned before I force this upon you. I looked at the king who was willing to let his kingdom crumble for my sake, and my heart ached with a love so fierce it was painful. And what of your people? Your world? I asked softly. He closed the space between us, his hand rising to hover just beside my cheek, his touch a ghost of a caress. Let it all turn to dust, he said, his voice thick with a desperate, unwavering conviction. I would rather rule a kingdom of ash than see you become a prisoner to fate. I will not use you that way. It was a vow, a renunciation of his destiny for my freedom, and it was the most profound declaration of love I had ever heard. Our raw, painful honesty left us suspended in a moment of impossible choice, the fate of a kingdom hanging in the charged air between us. But before either of us could speak, the deep, resonant blast of a ceremonial horn echoed from the courtyard below, a sound that signaled an emergency summons. Seconds later, a royal herald appeared at the observatory door, his face a mask of formal neutrality. "The High King and Queen are summoned to the Grand Throne Room," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "Lord Valerius has invoked the right of address. He will speak to the full court on the matter of the royal succession and the king's duty." Kaelin's expression hardened into one of cold, unyielding resolve. He turned and offered me his arm, his stormy eyes asking a silent question. We were out of time. Together, we had to face the vipers, without knowing if we stood as partners, as lovers, or as two souls about to watch their worlds burn. We walked into the throne room, not as king and queen, but as two soldiers marching toward a final, uncertain battle. Kaelin's arm was linked with mine, his touch a steady, grounding force against the tidal wave of hostility that met us. The entire elven court was assembled, a sea of perfect, impassive faces that watched our approach with cold, glittering eyes. Lord Valerius stood before the twin thrones, his posture one of righteous indignation, a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and unspoken malice. He began to speak, his voice resonating with false piety, decrying a king who had forsaken his sacred duty for a misguided affection. His gaze, sweeping over me with contempt, he painted me as a barren human vessel, a flaw in their grand design, and Kaelin as a weak ruler who refused to use the tool he had acquired, jeopardizing their very existence for a foolish sentiment. Valerius's voice rose, weaving a tapestry of fear and xenophobia for the assembled lords. He twisted the words of the prophecy, claiming it spoke not of a union of strengths, but of a catalyst to produce a pure-blooded heir, an heir my tainted human blood could never create. He accused Kaelin of heresy, of deliberately misinterpreting their most sacred texts to justify his unnatural attachment to an outsider. The accusation hung in the air, a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of Kaelin's authority. Then he delivered his final treacherous blow. He called upon the High Council to invoke the ancient right of regency, to strip Kaelin of his crown and place the kingdom under a more capable hand, his own, until the mortal problem could be permanently solved. It was a declaration of war, a meticulously planned coup unfolding in the heart of the kingdom, using my life as its justification and its prize. Before a single lord could voice their support, Kaelin released my arm and stepped forward, his presence commanding the absolute silence of the hall. He did not look at Valerius. He looked at his people. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but filled with a raw, resonant power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Moonstone throne. He confessed everything. He told them of the visions of the years he had watched a woman of impossible strength fight for survival in a dying world. He told them he had brought me here not as a political tool, but because he had loved me before he had ever spoken my name. "You see a human," he declared, his gaze finally locking with mine across the room, a universe of devotion passing between us. "I see the fire that will save us. Her heart is the magic we have lost. I choose her over the prophecy, over this crown, over all of Ethelgard. I choose Lyra." The weight of every eye in the room shifted to me. I was no longer an accessory to the conflict. I was its epicenter. For a single terrifying moment, the scared, invisible girl from the blighted village threatened to resurface. But then I looked at Kaelin, at the king who was willing to let his world burn for me, and I felt not fear, but a strength I never knew I possessed. I stepped away from the throne, my simple gown a stark contrast to the glittering finery around me, and I walked to the center of the floor. My voice, when it came, was not a queen's command, but a woman's truth. I spoke of the dust and the hunger, of the promise to my parents. I came to Ethelgard to fulfill a pact, I said, my voice clear and unwavering, but I will stay to build a future, not as a sacrifice to a prophecy, but as a partner to the man I love. This is not my duty, it is my choice. As I spoke the word choice, a warmth bloomed in my chest, a brilliant golden light that pulsed outward, visible even in the crystalline glow of the throne room. It was the raw, untamed fire of my spirit, the resilience forged in hardship, finally unleashed and meeting the ancient magic of this place. The elven lords gasped, their serene masks cracking as they felt a surge of vitality they had not experienced in centuries. Cailan stared at me, his face a portrait of utter awe and profound love. He crossed the distance, between us in 3 long strides, and took my face in his hands. "You are the prophecy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Then, before his entire court, he kissed me. It was a kiss of equals, a joining of 2 souls who had found their other half. And as our lips met, the golden light exploded, washing over the entire hall in a wave of life-giving power, sealing our union and healing his world. In the seasons that followed, Ethelgard began to breathe again. The spires hummed with a renewed energy, and the streams once again sang their magical song, their melody a testament to a love that had defied destiny. From the highest balcony of the palace, Cailan and I watched the sunrise paint the sky in hues of rose and gold, a dawn for our people and for us. His arms were wrapped around me from behind, his chin resting gently on my shoulder. My own hand rested protectively over the slight, gentle curve of my belly, where a new life, a new hope was beginning to stir. His hand came to cover mine, our fingers intertwining over the promise of our future. We were not a king and his packed bride, but 2 halves of a single soul, a man of moonlight and a woman of fire, who had found in the other's broken pieces the strength to build a world anew. If this story of a love that healed a kingdom has touched your heart, please show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel for more journeys of the soul.